Thank you, everybody, for coming. I can't tell you how impressed and appreciative I am by the incredible interest that has been demonstrated for this project. You know, when Eric and I were first talking about putting something like this together, we really weren't sure what kind of interest we were going to get, particularly considering we were thinking of 5 weeks worth of a couple hours. So this really is truly amazing. Thank you for taking the time. And a huge thanks to Rich Wanschneider. So Rich took this crazy idea we had and basically fleshed it out and got these fantastic guests from all over the Northwest to come join us each week. And all of this wouldn't be possible without some generous support from the Meyer Memorial Trust, the Ford Family Foundation, Pacific Power Foundation, the Yard Foundation, and even our local Seroptimists. So thank you. If you don't mind, I would love to just say thank you. So what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Why are we here? Almost 3 years ago, our land trust started a community outreach process to provide input into a strategic conservation plan. We wanted to hear from our community about what priorities we should be focusing on our land protection program. And I think just about every person or organization in this room participated and contributed to that process. So based on what we heard, we developed a roadmap which guides our conservation work today. And this plan identifies 4 priorities of places that we should be focusing on. And one of those places, or one of those priorities, was preserving community values. And this is something that we heard from you. And the key element of preserving those community values was protecting lands of cultural and historic significance, and also assisting the tribes in securing and protecting sacred geographies. Nez Perce people who have called this area home for thousands of years know better than anyone what it means to be connected to the land and to be good stewards of that land. And we quickly realized that this was a wonderful opportunity for us to strengthen our relationships with the tribes. And we really wanted to do that together with you, our partners in the community, who actually, told us in the first place that we should be doing this. And as we talked about this within the land trust, we understood that we really needed to start at the beginning. We needed to understand the historical context. We needed to understand the tribal perspective from tribal people. We needed to hear tribal voices. And we needed to make a concerted effort to invite Nez Perce people into the discussion. So here we are today. And perhaps some of you are here for the very reasons I just outlined. Or maybe you're just curious about Nez Perce people and the history of this place. Maybe your boss made you come today. Or maybe you just like the idea of a free lunch, which yes, we do have for you. Thanks to Heidi Wilson, she's amazing. We'll be giving you a wonderful sandwich bar. But regardless of the impulse that led you to be here today, I'm so glad that you are willing and able to take the time, and I'm certain that you will be glad that you did. And I just wanted to end with a why we're here, real briefly. I hope you'll indulge me from this introduction of the book that all of you should have a copy of. This is by Jeremy Five Crows. And he says, after living here for thousands of years, the Nez Perce know how to live in this place. They know the stories of this place, and they're forever tied to the place where our ancestors' bones eternally rest. It is a unique land, and we are a unique people. We are the Ninipu, and we are of this land. It is my hope that as you read this wonderful book, especially if you do so in conjunction with a visit to Nez Perce country, that you will catch a glimpse into the culture and lands that make us who we are and gain a greater understanding of what it means to have a sense of place. As you learn about us, our history, and our connection to our homeland, think about how you can listen and to learn from the land where you live. The message that we are of this land is true for everyone on the earth. I hope that what you learn from our history and our tribe will inspire you to make that phrase meaningful in your own life. And so, for this great reason, not only to read this book, but for you to be here with us today and for the next 5 weeks. So with that, I would love to pass it on to Mr. Wanschneider.
Thank you, Kathleen. I was just thinking of the people who were here when I got here in 1971. Ted and Sharon were here about the same time. Of course, he'd been here earlier, but you couldn't have gotten this kind of a group together in 1971, could you, Jay? The interest in Indians nationally and locally was minimal. We'll have some up for Chief Joseph days and have them put up a teepee, and then they can go home. You know? Gradually, things have changed, and one of the big reasons that things have changed is Alvin Josephi, but I'll get to that in a minute. My personal history, so I get here in '71. Sometime early on, I meet Alvin, so I start getting involved a little bit there. I opened the bookstore in '76, so people come in, and there are people from elsewhere. And Alvin used to say there are more people in New York that know more about the Nez Perce than people who live in Oregon. And because the national story, the story of the Nez Perce story, nationally and internationally, was actually in 1971 better known than it was in Wallowa County or in Portland, I would say. Anyway, so I got involved a little bit there, and then there was a push to extend the boundaries of the national park, which was only in Idaho at the time. And Ralph Swinehart and I got involved with that with some other people. And I think the first Indian meeting I ever went to was in the basement of the library in Enterprise with I remember Alvin was there, and Anton Minthorn was there, and I can't remember who else. But at any rate, we had some meetings, and there was a big confusion, of those of you who remember, because at the same time, Rick Bailey was pushing the idea of a Chief Joseph National Park in Hell's Canyon. And the Nez Perce National Historical Park out of Spalding, Idaho, wanted to expand, and it is still, I think, the only, Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, the only national park that's not all owned by the Park Service or contiguous. So that there are sites all over Oregon, Montana, and Idaho, and Washington that belong to the Nez Perce Park. Anyway, there was confusion, so the county court said, no national park here. And Ralph and I went and had a meeting with who else was there? Anyway, Gene, maybe. We met with the county court and said, no, this is not the same thing as what they're talking about in Hell's Canyon. This is a historical park dedicated to the Nez Perce story. So with their approval, then the senators, Hatfield then got on board, and that passed. So we now have national park sites at Doug Bar and at the Overlook. They're on Forest Service ground, and again, the park is in Spalding. So anyway, shortly after that, I became involved with what is now the Homeland Project, or the Nez Perce Homeland in Wallowa, which has been an incredible journey. And I tell you, when I came to Wallowa County in 1971, I knew nothing about the Nez Perce. Did not know the story. So I have accumulated this story by reading and by meeting people, Nez Perce people over the last 45 years, 46 years or whatever. Now, just a couple words about Alvin, and I think this is important because it's why the interest in the Nez Perce story, why we should be concerned about the Nez Perce story. As I said, the Nez Perce story was known widely. It was the Nez Perce War was covered with the Telegraph. Okay? New York newspapers covered the Nez Perce War. At the conclusion of the war, after capture and whatnot, and Joseph and the people straggled into Bismarck in North Dakota, the people of Bismarck threw a meal for Chief Joseph. The national sentiment was largely with the Nez Perce, not the Northwest sentiment, but the Nez Perce sentiment. When Chief Joseph died in 1904, the New York newspapers said the most famous Indian in America has just died. That story kind of laid low for several years for a lot of reasons that we're going to find over the next 5 weeks. Alvin Josephi was a war correspondent in World War II in the Pacific. He was working for Time magazine in 1951, and he was supposed to do a story on Idaho. He went to Lewiston, and they went out to the res, and his hosts were meeting with some officials, and a young Nez Perce guy said, "You're from Time magazine, do you know the Nez Perce story?" Never heard of the Nez Perce. Alvin used the next 12 years of research, and it changed his life around. And he really, I think, is largely responsible for bringing the Nez Perce story back to national attention. A couple of things about Alvin that are different. Number one, what I was going to say, he was coming from war. When he heard the Nez Perce story, he said immediately, here is a great American epic. And he started looking for the roots of the story. And of course, all the stories were the white generals and the white warriors and the white missionaries. So he dug and dug, and then he found a guy named Lucullus McWhorter and a book named Yellow Wolf. And then he found at that time there were still 3 survivors of the Nez Perce War alive. And he went to Sweats with them, he talked to them. I think one of his contemporary historians, who happened to be Indian, said, in the 1950s, when it was not popular, Alvin Josephi listened to Indians. So we have told the Indian story from the outside so many times, and Alvin really made an effort to tell the story from the inside. And that was his contribution with the Nez Perce story, and he went on, including, how many of you have been to the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C.? Well, he was the founding board chair of that, and the idea was to allow Indians to tell the story of that. So, interestingly enough, that story of the Nez Perce, I work at the Josephi Center, I have Alvin's books, people come in there, especially in the summer, they come in day after day. They've got some little corner of the Nez Perce story, and they're off on a toot. They're a retired Marine from California, and they've got to write a book about Nez Perce warriors and their ancestors, the German-American warriors. Now, I've never been sent a copy of that book, so I don't know if he did it or not. But anyway, they're a doctor in the Puget Sound. They retire, they read a book on Chief Joseph, they get in their car and drive here, spend 2 days here, and then they go home and send me an email, I'm on my way to Nez Perce now. Okay? They come up for a graduation, their son's graduating from University of Idaho, and they find the Nez Perce story, they go home to Colorado and retire, and the next summer do a camping trip and go to every place along the Nez Perce Trail. It goes again and again. People find this story, and it's compelling for so many reasons, but I just want to show you a couple of examples of what happens today. The last big book on the Nez Perce, Thunder in the Mountains, is a dual biography of General Howard and Chief Joseph. For those of you who don't know, General Howard is the Howard of Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and head of all the freed slaves after the war, after the Civil War. And he started, this guy's contention, this guy teaches at Vanderbilt, and his contention is that Howard felt that he had failed in that mission to give the Indians education, land, and religion, or to give the freed slaves. And then when he got in trouble in D.C. and his buddy General Sherman sent him out here, he got in the midst of the Indian business here. And so he thought, oh, I'll give the Indians land, meaning carved up 80-acre plots, and I'll give them some religion. The blacks had the religion right, but according to him. And then I'll give them education. And that was his goal. So this guy sees the Nez Perce War as the culmination of the failure of Reconstruction in the Civil War. Just one more. This guy, and I haven't made it through this, I've tried. Dying Grouse, 1,100-page novel of 1 year, the year of the war. Okay? 1,100-page novel with 200 pages of footnotes. Okay? This is one novel in a series of 5, which is about the European conquest of North America. And so he uses the Nez Perce story. I guess there are 7 books, and this is number 5 or something. But anyway, here's a guy who spends years researching the Nez Perce story, because he's going to use the Nez Perce story as a totemic event and the European conquest of America. So it just always floors me, and I always have to ask, the last visitors to the center were the Reinhardt family. 4 siblings, and they're all in their 50s, one from California, one from Michigan, one from Seattle. I don't know where the other one was from. They decided to meet here because the Reinhardts, there were Reinhardt settlers here, and Reinhardt had a relationship with Chief Joseph that brought him from all over the world to meet here. And sure enough, in the Horner papers, there are about 25 pages of Reinhardts in Somerville and in Wallowa County, and they went off, and Reinhardt, it turns out, was part of the militia from Somerville that came up here during the Troubles. Okay? I mean, it goes on, and I just think that you and your various agencies and in your personal lives can be enriched by the Nez Perce story, because it is not only an iconic Indian story, an iconic American story, it's just an iconic story. I can just finally say that I think, and Gene will vouch for me, that we have visitors, Gene and Mary, we have visitors from around the world who come to Tamcalix, who come to Joseph Days, and what they want to know is this where Joseph was? Okay? We have a town named after Joseph. We have a rodeo named after Joseph. Probably, Charlie, his name was never Joseph. Right? Even the Spalding gave him the name Ephraim, I think. But we whites have interpreted the story, and his father was called Joseph, so when his father died, he becomes Joseph. Anyway. Okay, so in the course of these various organizations and things I've been involved with, I had the good fortune to meet a lot of great people, and one of the really good friends that I've met is Charlie Moses. Charlie is Colville Nez Perce. He's been a godsend to the Nez Perce homeland, I would say, wouldn't you, Mary? He's been a real guiding light for us there. But he has, so he's Wallowa or Joseph Band, who grew up at Nez Perce. And I think a little bit of his story and some of the comments, I don't know exactly what he's going to say, never know exactly what Charlie's going to say, but it's always good. But again, some reasons that we living in this valley should pay attention to the Nez Perce story. Okay? Charlie Moses, come on again.
Everybody has their reference books, and I carried 2 when I was working on the trail, just 2. I really just carried 1. And I think if you read it and you study it, you'll learn mostly about the Nationals, Yellow, his own story. A companion book is Hear Me, My Chief, both written by L.B. McWhirter of the Yakima Valley. I really don't know how to start. I was given an assignment and said, come down here and talk about your early childhood and the war and everything like that. And I like to kind of know who my audience is. And my story can drift either way. It don't matter which way it goes. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit. I'm not going to tell you about the war.
Yeah.
There's people I go on later session. I think the guy from Lapway, he's quite friendly. Like that. And then later on, towards the end, we have 2 of our religious people from this field kind of summarizing it. So I'm going to try to stay away from the religious, the war, and specific. And so, what else is there? I one time followed 2 prominent Indian speakers talk about economic development. And and they were given an hour or two long talk, each one of them. And so afterwards, I got up to put him, I says, me too. And after you listen to the passionate speak of our leader here, it's kind of hard to get that passionate about things. First of all, the Chief Joseph Band in Nez Perce, most of them, 150 of them, after the war, after 7 or 8 years exile in Oklahoma, were separated at Riparian, which is an old train station on the Snake River. 150 went north to Caldwell, and about 120 went back to Lapwing. And I have trouble today finding out how this group from Umatilla got there, because they're not talked about in each one of these divisions. Today at Caldwell, the Joseph Band and Nez Perce number about 400 to 500, and we're expanding rapidly. Joseph was not welcomed by the Caldwell Confederate Tribes, which is a band of, before Joseph came there, 11 tribes, small individual little tribes along the Columbia River, and the Mackinac River, the Lake Chelan, and the Columbia River. They were a separate Salish-speaking tribes. And even though linguistics say that there's a distinct difference between the Okanagan speaking Salish and the speak over there on the H. William side of the reservation. But Granddad said there's really no difference. You just kind of got to drift with the lingo. And he could go from where we live in the Caldwell all the way to Flathead, which is also a Salish speak, which is Montana, which is a Salish speaking town. He could speak with them all. You know, it was just a little variation of words. And that's true with the Nez Perce and the Palouse. The Palouse is just kind of a little variation of Nez Perce. But the Palouse pretty well died out, probably died out, the language. In fact, they started looking for Palouses some years ago, and they said, do you know any Palouses? And I said, yeah, I'm Palouse. My grandmother's Palouse. My grandfather is Nez Perce, Black Eagle, Waptis Chimuk. His father is Watolan. And so we go back quite a ways in Nez Perce and Palouse. But getting back to the Caldwell. The Caldwell is not a treaty reservation. The Caldwell is an executive order reservation established in 1872 and consists of almost all the northwest Washington, or northeast Washington. There was a group of Moses, which I'm half of, that lived around the city of Moses Lake. And as the settlers moved into the country, they decided they need to move the Moses off the area around Moses Lake, and they moved them over to around Lake Chelan, and they gave them a big reservation. From Lake Chelan, from the Columbia River to the top of the Cascades, all the way to Canada, they gave the Moses tribe. And along with the 2 or 3 tribes that were already there. And then all of a sudden the good people of Washington decided that was too much land for the Moses. So they gave any Moses member within that group, which included several other little tribes, they gave them 640 acres. And a couple of those 640 acres happened to be along Lake Chelan. And if you know where Lake Chelan is, there's only one allotment left on Lake Chelan that's Indian owned, and it's owned by my brother-in-law and his family, the Wapatos. And it's worth millions, millions. But Moses was then moved to Nespelem. And he volunteered, he didn't take allotment like a lot of the other people did, so he moved to Nespelem. And he wasn't originally there, because there was a little tribe called Nespelem, was already there. But there was only about 30 or 40 of them. They had this whole area along the Columbia River. And so the Moses group moved in, and with about 300 members, and dominated that area. And when Joseph come back, when he went to got to Riparian, and they split. Now Joseph was never given the choice whether he could go to Caldwell or not. The people in Lewiston says no, and the people in Lapway says no. We do not want to make that troublemaker here. And so he was told he was going to Caldwell. And so his true followers, 149 Nez Perce, followed him to Caldwell. They didn't have to go. They could have went all to Lapway. But they followed him to Caldwell. He didn't go directly to Caldwell. He went to Fort Spokane and stayed one winter there. And then he went across the river, the Columbia River, and started looking for a home on the Caldwell. Now, Caldwell at that time encompassed everything north of the Columbia River all the way to Canada. Probably about 2 to 3 million acres. And so he went across the river and started riding, and there was a chief on one of the San Wallowas. He was a big Indian doctor too. And back in the middle 1800s, the people really believed in Indian doctors. And they were scared of them. They were powerful. And it's all whether you believe it. They could kill somebody by just, doing things. And you got in your head and you died. There's no question about it. But anyway, there was an Indian doctor and a chieftain named Scholastic. And they come across the river, and the superintendent who was in charge of the group was from around Welton. He brought them across the river. He met with the Scholastic people in a big amphitheater, and thousands of San Juan Indians there. And they didn't want him there. So he moved over to the next mountain, and we have a big valley. We have a valley called San Juan that is as pretty as this. It is as pretty as this. And he moved over to the valley, and Scholastic was there. He says, no, this is part of my tribe too. So then Moses was over in Nespelem. And Moses had met Joseph at Spalding when he was a young boy. Moses was given the name Moses, and Joseph was given the name Joseph about the same time. And Moses says, I love Chief Moses, come over here to Nespelem. So that's how Joseph got to Nespelem. He is invited to the Nespelem Valley and Nespelem by Chief Moses. They still weren't loved. And they're not loved today. But it's getting better. One of I was doing some work on and up there, and so we were talking about Chief Joseph. We were getting a little concerned about the use of his name, the use of his picture on the Lapway flag. What really got to us is they had a picture of him on, I think, on a jump court. Now, I've never seen it, I was just told. In a center basketball court at Kamiai or someplace like that. They had his picture there. We went down to a meeting in Spalding. We were just when we expanded the park, they was talking about 4 of us went down there. And we said we are not happy with the Nez Perce tribe who rejected Joseph having his picture on their flag, but we are really not happy unless we understand that his picture is on that jump in the circle. Put Royer's picture there. That's not belong there. That he was from that area. Put Royer's picture. I'm varying my story because I didn't think you would be bored by my growing up in this field. And I can move along, and I can move all day. But getting back to this field. So Joseph ended up in this field because his friend Moses was there. And he was there, and at that time, the chiefs pretty well ruled the tribe. And what finds us, of course, this is our Inmatoilikat. You know his name is Inmatoilikat. Whether I pronounce that right or not, it's kind of a hard one. Its translation is varied. And it says, thunder flying off the water to higher, loftier heights. And that's our chief. This is his grave marker. This is at our cemetery in this field. We have a Nez Perce. We have a cemetery of the two Sahapan-speaking tribes, the Nez Perce and the Palouse, are almost all buried there, except if they married the Moses family, like myself, then we have our own big Moses cemetery, which is bigger than the Nez Perce cemetery. And this is Yellow Wolf. Very few pictures of Yellow Wolf, but this is Yellow Wolf. And we have 2 monuments in the cemetery that are put up by I can't remember who put up Joseph's monument, one of the big railroad magnets. And then I think this Washington State Historical Society put up Yellow Wolf's monument. Lester Yellow Wolf was one of the Yellow Wolves I knew. And we came to a meeting up here in Enterprise in the Forest Service. In fact, I want to talk about the Forest Service. That Forest Service office and that front view was probably the most beautiful office and the most beautiful view that you could have in the world. And then it burnt down. And you never rebuild it. We looked, are you going to rebuild it? Are you going to rebuild it? But even the display inside there was just unbelievable for visitors. And we went there. We used to have joint meetings between the Forest Service, Spalding Park, and the Caldwell tribe, and Lappy tribe if you wanted to come to. And Lester came there with us one time. He was the grandson of Yellow Wolf. And it was his first time back in the valley. And Lester had a difficult life. But he got there and he was talking. They asked Lester if he had anything to say, so he cried. And he just couldn't speak of the valley because it was the first time he had been back. The only time he had been back in his life. My knowledge of the war is limited. Like he went with Joseph from Oklahoma and went on up there when they went there to this field. And we had a problem. The old or young warriors who fought in the war, a lot of them used to make a journey back to Lapway to visit. Sometimes they stayed all winter. And sometimes they took up with another wife. And that's the way Black Eagle, he did. He thought he'd have both ways. And so my grandmother found out about him and kicked him out, just like the Navajos, and throws his saddle out the hill gun. Said, "You're not welcome." And unfortunately, he was really not welcome in our family after that. And so I didn't get the stories from him. I was too young anyway. Our family didn't get stories. And the other thing, we grew up when there was no electricity, no TV, very little radio. And so we still carried on in the 50s the tradition of stories in the evening. On a good evening, we would get the old foam berries out, potion as we call it. That's, I guess my Lappic and so I'm talking. And you beat it with corn husk, and he made Indian ice cream. And it was foamy, just pretty much like that foam candy I guess they have now. And Mom would start telling stories, and she would tell us stories. And Mom was probably the one thing about Mom, she was the last one of our family that went up to the mountain and got her spirit, her wagon, as he says. I don't know how many other people are that way. One time we ran cows. One time I was chasing our cows, or coming back out the mountain, checking our cows, and I was in high school. I could hear this noise, and I finally caught up to it. And it was a little Nez Perce boy, about 10, 11 years old. I knew who he was. And I said, "What are you doing here up by yourself?" He said, "Oh, my dad took me up on the mountain and left me there." Told me to get my spirit. You know, so he was walking home, the spirit didn't come to him. I had to go on the back of my horse, and I took him down as far as I could towards town. And so the spirit, to get in the spirit, has died. And that's one of our real problems today. We are unguided by a spirit. Our people have lost directions. They were inundated by Presbyterians, Catholics. When my mother died, and she had arthritis really bad, and when she died, I can't remember what day in December it was cold as hell. And we took her out to the cemetery. But first of all, the wakes were held at the individual homes. And we had a big lawn tent put up there because our house couldn't hold the 100 or so people that her relatives come. Back then it was just mainly relatives used to come to funerals. Now there's 300 people there that come to ours and expect to get fed and stuff. But they would start with Catholic service. She was a good Catholic. She married, her first husband was Catholic, Nantuya. Nantuya is famous for us down in this country because he was arrested for hunting back in 19... I can't see what year it was.
81.
81. He was arrested for hunting, and the courts then declared that they enforced the 1855 treaty that says no, he has the right to hunt here in the Wallowa country. I forgot where I was. But
Your mother's
When your
funeral.
mother died.
They would start with Wallowa. You know, we built that log house up at Wallowa. The lawn houses are a contemporary thing. Back in the old days, even in the 50s, we had a lawn house in the Spelem built in the 20s or so, 1913 I think. It was 24 by 36. That lawn house there over here is what, 50 by 40 by 80, 40 by 60, whatever it is. Anyways, so we used to hold, they used to hold services there once in a while, but it wasn't big enough. So all the funerals were held at the home. So at Mom's funeral, it started with the Wallowas people drumming and singing 12 songs. And when they finished, the Catholics would come in, they'd say a prayer, they'd say the rosary. And then after the Catholics came in, the Shakers came in. Mama was a big shaker. See, Mom had arthritis really bad. And back then, I just was diagnosed with arthritis the other day. I'm just going to have my knees replaced. Number 5th, I think. But Mom was diagnosed with arthritis as well as diabetes. And so she was sick from probably when she was 50 till she died when she was 70, really sick. But she would never go to a wheelchair. She hobbled around on her crutches all the time. But the Shakers would go and sing, and they have their own songs, just like the Wallowas people. So she had 3 religions, and when we finished up at the long house, or at our house and moved, we went to the Catholic church to have Catholic service, because Mom was a good Catholic, a really good Catholic. And you know, it was a sin to go to the old religion, or a Catholic to attend their old religion. And so Mom says, well, I'm going to be secret, and the priest there could speak Nez Perce. So she says, I'm going to fool him, I'm going to confess that I went to that Nez Perce services. So she started talking in Nez Perce, and Father Dunlap says, oh, that's okay, Katie. We understand, I understand that you believe in all 3 religions. That was before that big, what Paul at the Vatican Council II, he says, start recognizing the other religious and let them and work with them. But we got out to the cemetery, and the Shakers were big time speech makers. My uncle could talk for half an hour and say nothing. We had a big, we had a Charlie Oakman. Within this little article here I gave is the list of Nez Perce I went to the Spelem. And this is only a partial list, pretty complete, of the 1892 list of Nez Perce and Charlie Oakman. I really didn't know Charlie Oakman, who was a Shaker leader out down in Yakima. He moved to Caldwell to Shake. The Yakima, he married there. And between him and my uncle, they talked for an hour, and it was 15 degrees. And you couldn't shut them up. Yeah, they were high cotton. They were preaching like evening, and they had a big crowd, 300-400 people out there just shivering. And the Nez Perce, the Wallowas people were out there in their moccasins, you know. And it was getting really cold. And we finally got over it. But 3 religions. And I'm trying to give you an idea of what I grew up on. The Spelem, when I grew up, the closest thing to the Spelem is called Lostine. I looked at Lostine and I said, wow, this is almost like the Spelem is back in 1952. And this Spelem hasn't changed. It has changed. When I grew up, we went to school, a public school, probably 150, 200 students from 1 to 12. It was 25% white and 75% Indian. And we got along unbelievably. best I know, we had never had an interracial white say, "You're white, I'm Indian." No. Now, there was a lot of fights. They loved to fight. Every Saturday night after a few shots, let's get mad on that. Yeah, let's see that. We had this big celebration on July 4th, where back in the 50s, my brother and I would pitch 3 teepees, one for our family, then my grandfather, then my uncle. We'd pitch 3 teepees, and we'd move in there from probably the 1st of July till the 14th. We were there 2 weeks. And this is in 54. And those soldiers, this is after World War II, a lot of World War II people there. And the other communities from not Nez Perce communities come there and they'd stay. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I bet you'd see 10 or 15 fights out in this big, middle of this big circle. It was unbelievable. They'd fight over, you were in the Navy, I was in the Army, we were more better than you. Or you're a Caldwell, or you're a Nez Perce, and then Caldwell. And so, but anyway, they would be there for about 2 weeks. And Granddad, who was the last warrior of the Nez Perce War, he was young enough. He would come up and just feel him on the bus. He moved back to Lapway after Mom kicked him out. Our grandma kicked him out. And he'd come, and they said he'd get off the bus. Everybody traveled by Greyhound bus back those days. Everybody knew how to travel. And he'd get off, carry his suitcase, he'd walk by our tent and walk on by to one of the other Nez Perce, and he'd stay with one of the other Nez Perce families. And then he'd come and visit my mom. And if Mom wasn't there, Grandma made him sit out there in front of the teepee, out in the hot sun, until Mom came back and was back to visiting. But he really was a persona non grata. And we, as a family, we didn't get to know our grandfather for that reason. But, like I say, at Nez Perce had 2 grocery stores when I was growing up, 2 service stations, a confectionery, an ice cream house, as we call it, a dance hall, and a movie theater. Every Friday night, if somebody would come in from Spokane or something, bring a food movie, and we'd be all there, and we all went in. I think it cost 25 cents to get in, or 50 cents to get in the movie. Go to the movie, and then probably twice a month, the owner of the movie would move the chairs to the side of the and we'd have a dance. And it was big enough to hold 300 to 400 kids. And boy, would we have dances. All the community just loved to go. The white community, the Kulinam is on the reservation, but they didn't know when they were on the Indian reservation. Nobody told them that. They thought they were. But they'd come up there to Grand Coulee, which is across the river, Elmira, Wilbur, and then Omak, and they'd all come to, and they were most of those kids, probably 200 or 300 kids, and then them smattering of old guys. And the older guys, the old veterans, they'd be outside drinking and having a great time. But we never fought between the schools. And every once in a while, somebody would come up and want to pick a fight. And so we had 2 guys that were really tough. I mean, they were really tough. One was probably one of the best Indian athletes. Both of them were probably the best Indian athletes ever to play in Nez Perce. Basketball, baseball, football, whatever. And the other was one of the best Indian athletes to play at a school downriver called Brewster. And the chairman of the tribe called the tribes. Dad was the one I'm talking from Brewster. and the other was a guy by the name of Oliver Kokotis. And I think either one of them could have played for any Division II school in the country. In almost anything. Baseball. I was a catcher, I was a freshman, I was a catcher, and boy, he could throw that ball fast, he could throw that curve, and he could shoot that basketball any place around that court. And so we really, in 1 year, in school year 52 and 53, we had the best basketball team, the basketball team in the state. We won 17 straight. Rated #1 for I don't know how many months. Oh, I can't put her to sleep.
No.
I put her to sleep, she's yawning. But we had Indian families. Like I said, we had Indian families and white families, and they mixed unbelievably good. My best friend lives right down here in Wallowas. He was a 4-year letterman for Gonzaga. And they said he was the best guard in the state. I think he was one of the best guards in the country at that point in time. And he would always say, he says, boy, if we could get some of our buddies, our Indian buddies, to play basketball, go to college and play basketball, I think they could play any place. They were that different. When they went to Washington State, I got to give it to that for people that boost too. Along with my buddy playing at Gonzaga was a kid by the name of Eddie Madison. I don't know whether you knew Eddie Madison or not. He got killed up in the forest someplace. He got shot. I think hunting in some of their traditional terrains. But when I went to school, we had, when I was a freshman at Washington State, we had another Indian kid that well-known war dancer, Seth, Leroy Seth. Leroy Seth went to Washington State when I was there. And over in Lapway, there was another Indian kid playing basketball there by the name of Jess Tilden. And Jess's grandfather was in the war, one of the younger fellows of the citizens. And I'm moving on to, I was supposed to talk about schools and my going to college. And like I said, I must have bored her. But anyway, I worked for Nez Perce for 30 years. After going to college, I got a degree in business administration with a minor in economics. And I held basically one job for 30 years, but they just moved me up the ladder and moved up and up. And I enjoyed all of it. I worked in Montana, I worked in Nevada, I worked in Oklahoma, and then I finally came, my career, I had a career path I developed. We have a really good program at Bureau. We have people that would help you develop career paths. And so I took the career path and I went from the agencies. When I first went to work in Billings, Montana, my objective was to make an agency credit officer. I was a credit officer, grade 9. We got any federal employees here? You know what a grade 9 is. It pays pretty good now, but it didn't back then. But it took me 3 years to make a grade 9. I was up on northern Montana in a little town, a little reservation called Rocky Boy. Didn't have much there. It was really a welfare reservation. It was established under the Reorganization Act of 1934 or whatever it was. It was a bought reservation for homeless Indians. In 34, that's not too many years ago. And they assembled the Chippewa Crees, was a private group that was there. They were homeless, just wandering around Montana, and they put them there. And they had one of the beautiful, some grazing people here know, their animal unit month was 2 acres per AUM. If you got a range specialist here, it'll tell you that is unbelievably good range. 2 acres per acre. They had a drought in Montana when I was there, when I was up in Rocky Mountain. And we had rented out very little of the range, but the cow numbers were, the Indian cow numbers were down. I think we had a 2,000 head carrying capacity. It was down about 1,000, so we rented out 1,000 head. And the guys who were dropping out bid unbelievable money for that pasture. And so I went to count the cows in. I had many duties there. I went and counted the cows in. I met the truck there. The guy had about 2 or 3 trucks, the old 2-ton trucks. He brought the cows in. And he walked in the crowd. He says, "My God, they've got grass in the crowds."
Charlie, we're about to lunch, but would you comment a little bit on, so you were with the Bureau for 30 years, you came back and ranched up in Nez Perce.
Yeah, and the lady talked about that. You know, I went through a 2-year course on holistic management, and I took some lessons from Alice Savory.
Yeah.
Anybody know Alice Savory?
Yeah.
I organized that for 2 years under a Washington State University program to do holistic management, and we did it. We went through those courses. We had about 50 members of the tribe took the course, and it was really interesting. But I ran a 200 head cow calf operation. In fact, Joe McCormick, who you might know, he started running cows down here. A few, I think he had 10 head. So he says, "Charlie, can you mind moving some of your cows down here and we'll run them together?" And I said, "Yeah, I could peel off 100 head and send down here if you want." But we never did do it. But I got involved with Wallowa. Simply, one day I was at the lawn house. I wish you knew what a lawn house was. And my Uncle Joe Red Thunder was sitting at the head of the table after we had services to get ready to eat. And when they give the food out, you just don't go over there and sit down. They have a ceremony for that. And they drum and sing, and the men will distribute the fish and the meat to all the people there on the table. And the woman will distribute all the berries and the roots, because that's how the religion is divided. The men have their responsibilities and the women have it. Well, I was sitting there kind of back trying to nod me. Joe waved me over. "Charlie, how are you?" I said, "Good, good." Of course, we were talking Nez Perce. And he says, "You ever been to Joseph?" I said, "No." He said, "You ought to come down there. We have a parade. And you ought to bring your outfit." And I had just retired and gone to this field. And when I went to this field, my outfit, my full buckskin outfit from my grandfather had sat idle in my trunk for about 30 years. And when you bring that outfit out, you got to have a giveaway. So we assembled the tribe, and I had a giveaway. I think Tim Litz was there at the giveaway, just happened to be there, and some of you know too. And he says, "Who is that guy giving away?" I'd given away shawls and blankets and everything, you know, and this probably cost me a couple $1,000 to bring my outfit out. But that is the tradition. That is the way you're supposed to bring those old outfits out. And as Sharon Red Thunder used to say, who I mentioned, He said, you gotta bring those old outfits once a year and let them breathe. And let them breathe. Well, he got me down here and I rode the parade. I rode Joseph Parade. I was gonna bring some pictures. I didn't have nothing. I rode the Joseph Parade probably for 10 years, and finally Joe convinced me to haul his horse down here. And so I trailered his horse. I ran the ranch and I brought my horses down here. And finally I just brought my horses down here. And when he died, when Joe died, the lady from, I can't remember, Tri-Cities had a big racing stable there. And she flew a horse in from California to put Joe's saddle on and his outfit on. She says, I didn't like the looks of Joe's old horse. I didn't want to that's your horse. And I says, oh, I bought my own horse down, but I'll lead your horse about it. I had some unbelievably good horses. Most of my horses went back to national champions in the quarter horse business. National champions. I had one went back 3 ways. We had a horse, any horse people here? No? You ever hear music, Bob? No? I think he was broke here.
Who'd you say?
Music Bob.
Yeah.
He was a really unbelievable, beautiful horse.
Snyder's him.
Beautiful horse. Mark and owned, my wife owned a horse. Handmade music, was in Sire. And, but I was going to tell her, no, I've got some really good horses, so, but I let her horse. But I got involved with the Wallowa project, and he can tell everybody there if it's lunchtime. I think, I'm sorry I took so long. You can't believe I've got a story. Other than down here, the only one that I sleep on. Thank you.
So thank you, Charlie. How many of you have had the pleasure of just sitting and listening to a Nez Perce Indian tell stories for the half hour an hour? Okay? Now, in this little talk, we hit on the 4th of July. Why did Indians have celebrations on the 4th of July? Anybody tell me? Because in the 1880s, the government decided that Indians shouldn't have regalia and they shouldn't do dances. And they shouldn't do this shit. So the Indians, being smart, figured that if they came out on the 4th of July, they could parade their stuff out there. And the guys would say, oh, they're half civilized. They're celebrating our day.
Comment and follow him. Latvia people, everybody used to celebrate Columbus Day. And they danced, they're singing. And I think Dick Kaplan one time, Dick Kaplan, and says, why are we celebrating that? The beginning of the end. The beginning of the end. Why are we celebrating Columbus Day? So we could celebrate.
So we could celebrate. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to have lunch, and then we're going to listen to Tony for a while talk about different ways of looking at the past and his work. So everybody get up and stretch and grab Charlie for another minute. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I don't know why Richie chose to have a bureaucrat stand up here right after lunch. But first of all, yes, I do work for the Forest Service, but I want to disclose that, what I say up here is my own opinion. It does not represent any policy of the Forest Service or any decision or anything like that. So make sure I give that plug to my boss. What's the point of studying the past? What purpose does it serve? Is it merely the side effect of the acquisitive mind of, basic human nature? Or is there some intrinsic value that defies quantification or description? Is there something more to it? Is it even necessary to understand the past at all? Certainly understanding the basics of who, what, when, where, and why serves to help us navigate the complex social, political, and natural landscape that we live in. But the truth is, you can be pretty successful in life with a pretty rudimentary, or even flawed construction of the past. With regard to respecting the right of contemporary Nez Perce people to hunt, fish, gather, and pasture livestock on land managed by the Forest Service, you don't need a sophisticated understanding of the dynamic internal political, religious, and linguistic divisions of the Nez Perce tribe in 1855, 1863, or 1877. Nor do you need a detailed understanding of the complex 20th and 21st century political history between the Nez Perce tribe and the United States government to understand that it boils down to an effort to more perfectly attain sovereignty and self-determination for the tribe. Superficially, that would suggest that it's really not all that important to unpack the minutiae of the past. So what gives with it endless obsession with parsing out greater levels of nuance and detail? I don't have a good answer to that. It's what archaeologists do, it's what a lot of us do with the past. But the first section of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which is a watershed piece of legislation that I'll talk a little bit more about later, attempts to articulate a value for historic preservation and by extension, articulate a value of studying the past for the benefit for contemporary people, including the Nez Perce and including all of us here in this room. The first section of the National Historic Preservation Act says that the past can serve to provide spirit, direction, a sense of orientation to the American people, and the past can provide cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits. That's a pretty long list, and it sounds pretty nice, and it's pretty aspirational, but it's also nebulous, esoteric, and a little bit squishy. It sounds difficult to put into practical application, and it's something that archaeology and all of us studying the past have struggled to do with it for well over 100 years. So this is a significant conundrum for archaeology, and by extension, all forms of cultural resource management and inquiry into the past. At its worst, archaeology is a mere academic pursuit for trivial, irrelevant facts about the past. Efforts to make it more relevant, which is what many of us in this room are kind of directly or indirectly involved with, efforts to make it more relevant, more useful, are where things are in this. Is there a microphone in here? You guys hear me okay? Yeah. The United States is a nation of laws, so is the Nez Perce tribe. The laws are often a reflection of the social and political spirit of the times in which they are written. And in turn, these laws serve to shape the social and political direction of the interaction between the Nez Perce tribe and the federal government. Since at least 1906, this interplay between law and society has been a significant factor in shaping our relationship to the past. In other words, and this is kind of my main point of the whole presentation, in other words, the legal landscape is a significant factor in who does archaeology, who gets to do the past, and to whom it serves. The legal landscape has changed drastically in the past 100 years, and thus what we do with the past and how it intersects with contemporary interests has also changed. So let's start with the Antiquities Act of 1906. So while the Nez Perce tribe struggled to secure homeland and future for its people, American archaeology in the mid-19th century struggled to separate itself from its treasure-hunting, grave-robbing colonial roots. They certainly sought to understand the past. They were largely blinded by ethnocentrism and racial prejudice. It was unfathomable for most archaeologists of the era, for example, that the giant earthworks and mounds of the eastern woodlands had been built by the ancestors of the contemporary Caddo, Choctaw, Osage, Natchez, and other eastern woodland folks that lived all around them. Instead, many archaeologists, many of them, came from a very biblical tradition, assumed that those great places had been built by lost tribes of Israel or other vanished peoples. Archaeology at the time was very much an extension of colonialism, and its roots were colonial in nature. It was generally a competition of conquest and discovery amongst archaeologists, and in many cases between professional archaeologists and amateur grave robbers, which there was kind of a lot of interplay, and they weren't really that different. Certainly, early ethnographers, journalists, missionaries, and others that I'm sure we'll talk more about as the presentations go on, they were more interested in understanding the Nez Perce as a people. However, archaeology of the era imagined a disconnect between the ancient people who created the archaeological sites that they studied and the Indians that they saw all around them. They perceived a disconnect between historically documented modern tribes and the ancient people of North America. This disconnect lasted well into the 20th century. In the southwestern United States, you guys are probably all familiar with Mesa Verde. There's still this myth of the cliff-dwelling Anasazi at Mesa Verde who mysteriously vanished, despite the fact that it's plain to see that their descendants are alive and well at Taos Pueblo, Acoma Pueblo, and among the Zuni and Hopi. Some locally written works that were written all the way up into the 1960s make a clear demarcation between Paleolithic man in Wallowa County and the Nez Perce people. Obviously, you don't necessarily see that distinction anymore. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, American archaeology was firmly established as a subdiscipline of anthropology in American universities. And the reason I mention that is partially because it's a contrast to European archaeology, which is treated as a subdiscipline of history. Anthropologists of the early 20th century were furiously documenting what they perceived to be vanishing Indian tribes, destined to go extinct or be completely assimilated by Western culture. This view was prevalent in American society at large. The anthropologists and archaeologists were almost exclusively elite European Americans. They viewed Native American cultures as Stone Age, primitive relics of their own past. Indians were viewed as living representatives of what their ancient European ancestors might have been like. So by studying and documenting the Native Americans, they believed they were getting a glimpse into their own, quote-unquote, primitive history. So just as anthropologists believed they were documenting vanishing cultures of the indigenous nations of Western North America, the archaeologists saw themselves as being in a race against settlement, development, and amateur pond hunters to find and systematically excavate archaeological sites. This led to what I mentioned in the beginning, our first piece of legislation aimed at protecting archaeological sites, which is the Antiquities Act of 1906. Stick with me, folks, I will get around to the local stuff. The Antiquities Act primarily allows the President of the United States to create national monuments. These national monuments are intended to protect places of natural, cultural, or scientific interest. And mirroring the urgency of the anthropologists regarding Native Americans and archaeologists regarding archaeological sites, the creation of national monuments under the Antiquities Act was and is to this day done through presidential proclamation, which is much faster than the creation of national parks under the Acts of Congress. So it was created in a spirit of urgency. But a lesser known but relevant feature of the Antiquities Act is that it gives the Secretary of the Interior the authority to decide who is and is not permitted to conduct archaeological investigations on federal land and other forms of investigation into the past on federal land. Up to that point, collecting and excavating artifacts from federal lands was a literal free-for-all. So effectively limiting it to academic archaeologists was a good step. It kept the discipline on a path of professionalism and scholarly endeavor. On the other hand, it solidified an elevated status of elite academic archaeologists at the expense of folklorists, tribal elders, missionaries, and other folks who were outside of academia, but were also attempting to document the past. It isolated archaeologists in their own little bubble. Further, it elevated scientific interests above cultural interests, and it further alienated the interests of the people who were the descendants of the people who created these archaeological sites in the first place. So, that was the early part of the 20th century. And then we get into the Depression era. During the Great Depression, President Roosevelt's New Deal touched many aspects of American life, and not surprisingly, it also hit archaeology. As the title of the program suggests, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Excavations, the first and foremost goal of any of these relief excavations was to ensure that field crews were steadily employed. As I've touched on above, archaeology had long been considered an endeavor reserved for academics. But these New Deal excavations proved that a small number of trained professionals could lead large crews of untrained or semi-skilled workers. So in a sense, the Depression-era excavation programs democratized the act of doing archaeology and exposed many unemployed Americans from many walks of life to new ideas about the past. The work these young people, mostly men, did was partly just a kind of a make-work endeavor, like many New Deal programs, but also like many New Deal programs, it produced things that are still providing benefits today, including archaeological collections, maps, and photographs that are still being used to train and educate people today. So arguably, for the first time in its short history, archaeology during the Depression era served the needs of the broader public. But, you know, as a make-work endeavor, it was kind of in an unexpected way. It was focused on providing jobs for masses of unemployed men with the indirect benefit of conducting archaeological investigations of part of the country where they had never been done before. I don't believe a lot of that work was done in this era, but it did set the stage for what was kind of to come next in this region. So, after World War II, America's booming economy, expanding middle class, and increasing industrialization led to a push to create more dams and other river engineering projects for hydroelectric power, to provide more irrigation, to put more land under crop production, to make rivers more navigable for large ships. In other words, the federal government was doubling down on its quest to tame every major river system in the nation with dams. In the face of such drastic development, the Smithsonian Institution endeavored to salvage as many archaeological sites that would be permanently inundated by the construction of these dams through the project known as the River Basin Survey Program. This later morphed into the Interagency Archaeological Salvage Program. The River Basin Survey Program lasted from about 1945 to 1969, and it further systematized and professionalized American archaeology. Just as an aside, the Interagency Archaeological Salvage Program continues to this day. And also as a side note, the Nez Perce Tribe Cultural Resources Program, on places like Dvorak Dam, they're the ones who are leading that effort to document and monitor the sites that were affected by those dam construction. So, most of our systems of cataloging and numbering archaeological sites, the names and categories for different eras, periods, and phases, and how we conduct all aspects of archaeological inquiry have strong ties to this River Basin Survey Program. It was still considered part of some of the best pure archaeology done in the United States, and the cultural typology that we use still today was created in 1970 by Franklin Hardy and David Rice, who had direct ties to the river basin surveys that were done in eastern Oregon and Washington. So that's all well and good, systematized, professionalized archaeology. But on the other hand, the River Basin Survey was born of the tradition of the Antiquities Act. So it favored elite academic archaeologists. Also keep in mind that it was at the height of the modern era. We can talk another time about what the modern era is and isn't, but it was at the height of the modern era where anything done in the name of science or the greater good was deemed paramount, and any other consideration was just kind of cast to the side. The dams were going in with or without public approval for the greater good. Likewise, the archaeological sites were going to be used to answer questions deemed important to the academic community with little regard to the interests of the tribes or local communities with historical and cultural ties to the sites. Anything for the advancement of knowledge and science. It doesn't really paint archaeology in like the most community-oriented light, I suppose, but that is what it is. So the march of modernity, development, and industrial progress were not limited to rivers, dams, and hydroelectric projects. The federal government was also funding, sponsoring, authorizing major highway construction projects, housing and urban development projects, power plants, and relevant to the Forest Service, timber and mineral extraction had begun occurring at an unprecedented scale. These projects were leaving a wake of destruction on cultural resources. So in response, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. It is considered the most far-reaching legislation of its kind, and I can tell you from talking with some of my colleagues in botany and other areas that they're pretty envious of the power that our law protecting cultural resources has. Its most revolutionary and notorious aspect is Section 106. Maybe some of you have heard the concept of Section 106 consultation. In essence, Section 106 of NHPA created the cultural resource management industry essentially out of whole cloth by requiring cultural resource inventories or any undertaking that the federal government does that could conceivably affect an archaeological site. Further, it requires federal agencies to go through a specific process of consultation with the state and the tribes, and it's why I and thousands of other archaeologists have comfy, well-paid jobs in the Forest Service and other federal agencies. That's why there are hundreds of cultural resource management contracting firms all across the country. Through Section 106, tribes, the state, and in many cases local governments have been invited to the archaeological conversation for the first time in a meaningful, legal, institutionalized way. This is a huge change for the federal government. It's a major change for archaeologists, and it took years to implement that change. Locally, for example, the earliest attempts by the Forest Service to engage the state of Oregon, according to my files, which we all know burned up in 2010, so there might be some things I'm missing. According to my file, the first time it really started to happen was about 1977, which is 11 years after the NHPA was passed. And that's just with the state. Consultation with the Nez Perce tribe through Section 106 seems to have been slower to develop for a variety of reasons. Internally to the Nez Perce tribe, my reading of history is that the Nez Perce tribe spent much of the early and mid-20th century organizing its government and positioning itself to ensure sovereignty and self-determination. In addition, the tribe was focused on such things as building the fisheries program. Externally, it was fighting and winning court case after court case against state and federal agencies to govern their own hunting and fishing activities. I suspect that the trivial musings of academics and bureaucrats was a little lower on the list of priorities. Important, but less so than securing the basic needs of their people in the face of what we know is a pretty awful history leading up to that. But in defense of archaeologists and local archaeologists in the 1960s through the 1980s, there was a growing cadre of archaeologists who, in addition to their devotion to systematically gathering data in the name of science and scholarship, were recognizing and documenting sites of spiritual and cultural relevance and considering their significance to the Nez Perce tribe. I mean, we can think of the work of people like Bruce Womack. He tried pretty hard to try to bridge that gap. He was successful in a lot of ways. The problem is that despite the legal mandate of Section 106 to engage the tribes, the cultural and institutional divides that existed between the federal government and the tribes was real, and we just didn't overcome that divide. It took several other events beyond National Historic Preservation Act to begin to bring archaeologists and tribes closer together. The first was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1979. ARFA was enacted to return basic civil liberties and protect and preserve American Indians their inherent right for freedom of religious expression and to exercise their religious and cultural practices. It also brought to light the fact that these religious and cultural practices are intimately tied to specific and unique places for indigenous people. That includes the Nez Perce here in Wallowa country. But the landmark case that that kind of brought this to the fore for the Forest Service actually occurred on the Six Rivers National Forest in California. In this case, the Forest Service proposed to construct a highway and do a bunch of clear cutting through an area that was considered sacred to the Turok, Tlawa, and Karok tribes. Forgive me if I butcher those names because I've mostly read them, I've never heard them spoken out loud. Ethnographers combined, now this is kind of a significant development. When these ethnographers combined ethnographic, archaeological, and historical data to prove that the area that they proposed for road construction and clear cutting were an inseparable part of the tribe's right to freely express their religious and cultural beliefs. Many of you are familiar with the idea that wisdom sits in places, and many of these traditional ways of thinking and remembering are inseparable from the landscape. And this is the first time that the Forest Service recognized that. In its final recommendations, the report criticized the Forest Service for its ignorance of the physical and historical significance and the religious importance of the sites proposed for road construction and clear cutting. It said the philosophy that land management by the Forest Service is solely about natural resources was a flawed intellectual concept. The report traced the long history of the site as sacred to succeeding cultures of indigenous peoples, whose connection could be documented from prehistory using archaeology, through historical documentation, and through ethnographic evidence. Unfortunately, the outcome of this specific case was not clean and clear because before they could do the road building and clear cutting, the area was turned into a wilderness. So we don't know exactly what would have happened in this case if the weight of the issue would have rested on the cultural concerns. But what's significant here is that we finally see archaeology being put into the service of people, something that archaeology has long strived to create. But archaeology in the 70s and 80s was still largely operating in its ivory bubble. It was inconvenient to talk to Indians. While archaeologists were preoccupied with the nuances of artifact distribution and at an archaeological site and mulling over, projectile point technology and chronology and the finer details of making stone tools, my understanding is that indigenous people, including the Nez Perce, were often more interested in the past effects on their current political integrity, their current economic well-being, and the health and welfare of the tribe. So both parties were interested in the past, but for very different reasons and with little common ground. So enter the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, commonly known as NAGPRA. Native Americans had long objected to the display of the bones and funerary objects of their ancestors in museums. Indian remains had long been treated as scientific specimens first, museum attractions second, and human remains a distant third. Native American remains and burials were routinely excavated in the course of infrastructure projects and for scientific purposes. Where non-Native remains were routinely reburied or repatriated to their families, Indian remains were handed over to museums, medical research, and other educational institutions, and in some cases, police forensic departments for educational purposes. Beginning in the 1970s in Iowa, many states began passing laws to protect Native American remains in a manner commensurate with non-Native remains. It took several high-profile looting cases in the 1980s where Native American remains were tossed aside, and the gray goods associated with those remains were presumably sold in the black market before public outcry prompted Congress to finally act. NAGPRA requires federal agencies to return Native American cultural items to lineal descendants in culturally affiliated tribes. The cultural items that NAGPRA specifically covers are human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and items of cultural patrimony. At the time, many archaeologists who were still firmly convinced of the paramount aims of scholarly inquiry data collection, and pure science above all else were adamantly opposed to NAGPRA. However, the law had the unintended consequence of forcing archaeologists to engage tribes on an issue the tribes were passionate about. Sure, it was contentious, and it still is at sometimes. But what happens most often through the process of repatriation is the finding of common ground, the exchange of ideas and information, and the formation of collegial relationships. So that was a pretty significant shock to most archaeologists. They thought it was going to be terrible, and it turned out to be something pretty great. While many, if not most archaeologists are still genuinely interested in studying human remains, the discipline of archaeology has also learned that the act of repatriation, which is the sorting out of what remains are to return to which tribal group, in partnership with tribes, has created a space where archaeology can serve a greater, more noble purpose to living, breathing human beings. But the iconic case for NAGPRA that brought it to the world was Kennewick Man. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that case. Kennewick Man was found on the banks of the Columbia River in Kennewick, Washington in 1996. Radiocarbon dating indicated that he was approximately 9,000 years old at the time of his death. He was 38 at the time of his death. Morphologically, Kennewick Man did not fit with any modern human population, according to the archaeologists in charge of the investigation. And there were no objects found in association with him, so they couldn't really use any associated grave goods to tie him to the tribe. As a result, the archaeologists handling the case argued against repatriation, and the Umatilla tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, Colville tribes, Yakima, had all filed claims on those remains. So it led to this big, long, contentious battle. It created huge splits that were kind of starting to come, in the early 90s, there was kind of this little bit of a coming together of archaeologists and tribes, but then this case kind of started pulling people apart and putting them back in their heartland camps. In my view, both sides won, but the battle took its toll. Archaeologists wanted a chance to study Kennewick Man, and they finally got that chance in 2006. And in 2014, they published the results of their studies, which of course yielded interesting information about how old he was, his lifestyle, where he lived, what he ate, all that sort of stuff. But because initial morphological studies about his physical remains did not conclusively link him to any modern native groups, many in popular culture and the scientific circles questioned his status as a Native American, and by extension, they questioned the broad claim by Native American nations that they had been here since time immemorial. But thanks to DNA technology, it was determined that Kennewick's Man closest known modern relatives are members of today's Colville tribe in Washington. It's important to note that the Nez Perce, Umatilla, and Yakima were unwilling to submit DNA samples, which is understandable considering that science and mainstream society did not have a good track record of respecting Native American cultural traditions and historical claims. So it's likely that there are other people in Oregon and Washington today that may be having a closer tie to Kennewick Man. Well, suffice it to say that the DNA testing conclusively demonstrates that Kennewick Man is a Pacific Northwest Indian. Yet another piece of evidence in support of the claim by tribes that they had been here since time immemorial. Now, I don't know what time immemorial actually means, but I would say that if you have a relative that goes back 9,000 years and you can prove that genetically, I'd say that's pretty darn close. There are other factors at play other than NAGPRA that made the 90s a watershed period for bringing archaeologists, land managers, land management agencies, and the Nez Perce tribe together. Prior to about 1990, consultation with the Nez Perce tribe was sporadic and came up only on a perceived as-need basis by the Forest Service, or in some cases the tribes. We have some older letters in our file regarding communication with tribe about some very specific issues. But it was, like I said, it was sporadic, it was inconsistent, not real coherent or systematic. And that dates to the 80s, and it wasn't until about the mid-1990s when a series of other events led us to more formal consultation with the tribe. The Wallowa National Forest started doing formal government-to-government consultation and informal resource area to resource area consultation with the Nez Perce tribe on a regular basis, starting around 1990, according to our bureaucratic records that I can seem to pull together. And in 1992, the Forest Service created the position of tribal liaison to facilitate these efforts to connect the tribe with the Forest Service. But at the national level, some really significant events took place. In 1994, President Clinton signed an executive order directing agencies to develop meaningful channels of communication and consultation with the tribes. And then again, in 1995, a court case between the Lower Brule Sioux tribe and the U.S. government set precedent by stating that agencies must have meaningful consultation with tribes prior to making a land management decision. A year later, in 1996, a court case between the Klamath tribes and the United States government affirmed that federal land management agencies have a substantive duty to consult with tribes in decision-making to avoid adverse impacts on treaty resources. Since then, the Forest Service has had several other agreements with the Nez Perce tribe, some about specific topics such as camping and kind of mundane everyday things like that, and others are more general about consultation. Overall, our records seem to indicate that regular consultation for both cultural and natural resources within the Forest Service locally probably started sometime in the mid-1990s. So all of these treaty resource issues that kind of came up in the 90s are tied to ideas of the past, to ideas of heritage, and to identity for the Nez Perce people. The problem is that archaeologists have struggled to kind of figure out their role in this new landscape, shaped more by contemporary politics and current legal issues. We're kind of comfortable in our little bubble, interacting with like-minded people with similar perspectives. Throwing in all this treaty politics is new territory for us, and I know it's new territory for other folks in this room that are dealing with other treaty-related issues. But engaging with tribes on their terms, talking about issues relevant to their day-to-day lives, has enriched cultural resource management and federal land stewardship as a whole. One precedent-setting case took place at Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. Since the 1930s, climbing at Devil's Tower had become an increasingly popular recreational activity, one that the local Lakota, Cheyenne, and other affiliated tribes objected to on religious and cultural grounds. As the tribes gained standing in land management decisions that I described in the mid-1990s, they began to voice their concerns with that little bit of political power behind them. The tribes wanted to ban climbing for just a few weeks out of the year in June and in July, which was a critical time frame for spiritual activities at Devil's Tower. Monument superintendents attempted to impose a closure order to help facilitate those tribal activities. And most climbers did voluntarily honor the tribe's request to avoid climbing during that specified time period. But what the administrators found is they had no legal authority to create a closure specifically for tribal, religious, and cultural purposes. So in the early 2000s, Park Superintendent Dorothy Firecloud drafted legislation aimed at rectifying that problem and, in addition, address a suite of other NAGPRA-related issues. That legislation landed in an unexpected place, the 2008 Farm Bill. In a subsection entitled Cultural and Heritage Cooperation Authority. Specifically, this section of the Farm Bill says It authorizes the reburial of human remains and cultural items on national forest land, including human remains and cultural items repatriated under NAGPRA. It authorizes the Secretary of the Agriculture to ensure access to National Forest System land to the maximum extent practicable by Indians and Indian tribes for traditional and cultural purposes. And it authorizes the Secretary of the Agriculture to provide forest products without consideration, meaning for free, to Indian tribes for traditional and cultural purposes. It also authorizes the Secretary to protect the confidentiality of cultural information, so that it protected a lot of these sort of things and activities from the Freedom of Information Act disclosure. And it increased the availability of Forest Service programs and resources in support of the United States policy of promoting tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and it strengthens support for the United States policies of protecting and preserving traditional cultural ceremonial rights and practices under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. There's kind of a lot of cultural stuff just kind of stuffed into a farm bill in some random year, but it was a big deal. While we haven't on the Wallowa National Forest dealt with issues of closure orders or anything like that, we have this farm bill stuff has allowed us to come full circle with the Nez Perce tribe on a couple of really important issues. First, the Wallowa National Forest had already repatriated most of the human remains and funerary objects back to the Nez Perce tribe under NAGPRA in the late 1990s and early 2000s. To kind of back up a little bit, you know, there were quite a few human remains that were excavated in the 50s and 60s prior to the construction of Wild Sheep and what was the next? Hell's Canyon Dam in the 50s and 60s, and that included a number of human burials. Those remains have found their way to various museums across the nation, and in one case, a set of human remains was found to be in a deceased police officer's storage unit in New York State. But we managed to get it back. That was in 2010. But from the perspective of the Nez Perce tribe, giving those human remains back to them was just the first step. The remains of their ancestors needed to be reburied, ideally in the exact same place they came from. Given that these remains had come from lands now managed by the Forest Service, we would not have been legally allowed to rebury them in their original location without the authority granted to us by the 2008 Farm Bill. So in 2011, the Forest Service partnered with the tribe to rebury the remains where they had been excavated. Again, that was something that was not an option and that many national forests across the country had struggled with for many years. People wanted to put them back where they came from. We had archaeological records about where they came from, but it was simply illegal for us to do it. So, on a personal note, the act of working with the tribe to find all the correct locations using documents from the 50s and 60s, and to do the actual reburials was one of the most cathartic and rewarding things I've done in my personal life, and also in my career as an archaeologist. But I guess that's kind of ironic, in a way, that putting things back into the ground would prove so rewarding for an archaeologist. But it's also fitting for a person who is participating in a discipline that has searched so long for a higher purpose. So this era of working together that began with NAGPRA in 1990 and that was rejuvenated in 2008 with the Farm Bill, it created a momentum for others to join the Nez Perce tribe and the Forest Service in participating and collaborating on the past. So one of the big things in Wallowa County was that for years kind of loomed large was the 1887 Chinese massacre in Hell's Canyon, which was the worst massacre committed against the Chinese in the American West. Like I said, it cast a dark shadow on Wallowa County for many generations. In 2012, local museums, a handful of interested and passionate citizens, a book writer, and nationally prominent Chinese American cultural associations approached the Forest Service about putting a monument and holding a healing ceremony at the site of the massacre. The Forest Service, being the bureaucrats that we are, balked at the idea because it's against policy for us to erect monuments. You know, a lot of us in the Forest Service saw it as a good thing. We thought this was a good white hat project. We really wanted to see it go forward. We pushed it all the way up to the end. The regional office caught wind of it, and they said, it ain't gonna happen. But what happened is that, wait, let me find, I lost my place. So yeah, we all worked together to try to make this happen, but it just was not budgeted. But what provided that final push to make it happen was that it had the support of the Nez Perce tribe. They too wanted to see a healing ceremony occur at this site for their own, you know, cultural and spiritual reasons. So it was that letter of support from the Nez Perce tribe that kind of allowed us all to kind of come together and make this happen. So, on a lovely spring day in 2013, hundreds of people gathered at a remote site in Hills Canyon to hold a healing ceremony and unveil this interpretive monument, which I should have brought pictures. It's a large piece of granite. Blends in nicely when you look at it from the river, but it's clearly a nice monument when you're walking along the trail. What the monument revealed was that it described the miners who were massacred for their gold in 3 languages: English, Chinese, and Nez Perce. So to me, that speaks volumes about how far we've come, about who gets to participate in interpreting the past, and how the past is no longer the exclusive domain of elite academics. The momentum of this project, I argue, came largely from the goodwill and collaborative spirit built up between the Nez Perce tribe and the Forest Service that was fostered by our mutual efforts under NAGPRA and the 2008 Farm Bill. I thought it was pretty fitted. Okay, so we talked earlier about the longhouse that's down at the Tamcoolix ground. I thought I had 45 minutes.
Well, is it 1:30 now?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Farm Bill allowed the Nez Perce tribe and Nez Perce will allow a homeland project to provide logs for the longhouse at the Tamcoolix ground. That's something else we would not have been able to do without the 2008 Farm Bill. So finding appropriate trees, coming up with a logging system, harvesting the trees, and moving them to Wallowa and processing them to the final form of the longhouse brought many newcomers into the world of cultural heritage and consideration of Nez Perce treaty rights. So again, the community of people committed to honoring treaties and traditions expanded well beyond archaeologists, land managers, and cultural resource folks. So in conclusion, give me another minute or two. In Wallowa County, the National Forest is largely the place where the Nez Perce tribe exercise their treaty reserve rights. It's been a long, twisted journey to finding common ground and establishing working relationships, but we're at a point now where natural and cultural resource specialists from the tribe and the forest meet regularly to discuss all aspects of resource management on the lands managed by the Forest Service. It's not always easy or convenient, but we're at a point where we have constructive dialogue and finding common ground occurs regularly. I'd also like to point out that the one table over here is half Forest Service folks and half Nez Perce tribe fisheries folks. So interesting the way that we don't have any problems just hanging out. It's not convenient, but you know, history, tradition, and the responsibilities attendant to the Nez Perce treaties, in my mind, always loom large. And I think Wallowa Whitman National Forest Heritage Program Manager Sarah Crum said it best. And she said, "It seems that the Nez Perce have moved forward with more and more self-determination. as laws have been passed and as the Nez Perce have developed their own cultural resource programs, fisheries programs, wildlife programs, the Forest Service has followed along with increasing responsibility and accountability to the tribes. Maybe with some kicking and screaming on our part, the Forest Service, and certainly not always as quickly or as often or as in depth as the tribe would like. So indeed, we've come a long way in the days when only the most learned elite academics were allowed to have a say in what the past is and what purpose it serves. But I hope I've made a case that, in my view, in which a complex interplay of tribal, federal law, and social and cultural trends have brought the Wallowa National Forest to a point where archaeology and heritage resources is more purpose-driven and service-oriented toward the interests of the local community and the Nez Perce tribe. Thank you.
The second book that I think is interesting to kind of know. One is this, the relationship between Nez Perce history and our history here to total American history. The Northwest was divided between 1918 and 1948 into that contested territory, joint occupation, right? And there was a big fight between the Americans and the British. And for those of you in natural resources, part of that fight was David Douglas. David Douglas was sent by the British to catalog plants in the Northwest in 1823 to put a foothold in the Northwest for the British. The Hudson Bay Company also had a policy of trapping out all the beaver south of the Columbia River and east of the Columbia River so the Americans wouldn't come there. So that's how brutal the system was. The Nez Perce, by the way, it's mentioned in there, were not trappers, they were traders. And I think one of the things that Charlie touched on today is, and the other thing you have there is a map with the names of village headmen. I think one of the crucial misunderstandings to understanding Indian history and Northwest Indian history is the Americans, the whites, constantly looked for a leader, a chief. And the Indians were organized by village. They were autonomous villages. And that map that was in Giuseppe's big book, it doesn't even say Nez Perce or Cayuse or what. It just says Tuicacax, or, gives the Indian name. So that was the organizational structure, and it was one of the huge cultural misunderstandings as the whites got here. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you all for coming. And hope to see you all next week.